This show is listener supported. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is Season 4, Episode 10, Alice. I'm your host, Haley Radke. In today's episode, Alice shares her experiences of secrets in an in-family adoption, and also how her recent reunion with her biological father alerted her to some of the damaging ways her adoptive mother behaved. Alice and I talk about signs of narcissism, and she walks us through some real-life examples of how this behavior showed up in her life and what she's done to walk away from the toxicity. I want to warn you before we begin, though, that we do reference domestic violence in this episode. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Alice. Welcome, Alice.
Hi there, Haley.
I'm so excited to get to hear your story. I know you a little bit. We have connected online, and you've shared a little bit about your journey with me, especially with regards to narcissism and codependency. So we're kind of talking about the ugly side of relationships today. But
that's right.
Yeah. So it might be a little bit of a harder conversation, I'm thinking, for people to listen to, lots of hard themes, but I'm so honored that you would share your story with us. So why don't you start with that today?
Okay. I was born in the early 1970s. And the way that this happened, this was the story that I received, was that my mother, my natural mother, was nearly 15 when I was born. So she was really quite young. But she had not told any of her family that she was pregnant, and nobody noticed. So she literally went into labor with me and went to the hospital. And I don't really know the details of that. I never got the opportunity to kind of ask her that story in detail. But, she went to the hospital, and the next thing, her mother got a call and was told, your daughter's in hospital having labor, or in labor. And of course, her mother was kind of really shocked and everything, and went down, and there was this baby. And that's where the kind of adoption story gets a little bit strange, let's say, or not the usual thing, because obviously sometimes the usual thing was then for social services to come in and babies to be taken away and so on. But what happened in my family was that my great-grandmother, who was 85 at the time, said to her daughter, in other words, my grandmother, there's no baby of this family going anywhere. So we sort this out internally. And what happened was that my mother's older sister, who was 15 years older than her, was infertile. And so my mother was told, or, was given the one choice, which was a choice, which was either your sister has this baby and raises it, and adopts it, or we lose her entirely. And so she chose the former. And the story as well is that when my adoptive mother went to the hospital, my mother said to her, I've had a baby for you. And that's a story that kind of messed with my head for a while as I was growing up. But anyway, more on that later. Yeah, so I was adopted actually within my family, but it was a closed adoption. And the other element is that those two sisters were not full sisters, so they were half sisters. The older half sister, as I said, was 15 years older, and they basically had different dads. So yeah, I was raised by my adoptive mother, who was married at the time. So I remember being told when I was little some story about how my mom and dad, my adoptive mom and dad at the time, wanted me so much that they paid money for me. And that what that meant, actually, when I look back at it, and when I kind of found out the story, was that they had basically done a private adoption that was facilitated by the local doctor. And they had to fight social services because social services wanted to take me out of the county. And they had to hire a barrister or a lawyer to find case law, as it happens, to kind of show that that I should stay with my adoptive mother. So yeah, I was raised in, I was told that story from being very young. So I knew that I was adopted, and I just grew up with this kind of image in my mind of a mother that was out there. But I didn't know that that mother was actually my beloved auntie. So she was, my mother was kind of introduced to me and acted towards me as though she was my auntie and I was her niece. And I was very, very attached to her. I loved her to bits. She was like one of my favorite people in the whole world, her and my grandmother especially. The situation with my adoptive parents is that already by the time before I was born, my adoptive father was very violent. And so initially when they met, the story that my adoptive mother told me was that even before they were married and, then when they were dating, essentially, he would beat her up and he would say, "It's because I'm insecure. And once we get married, I won't feel the need to beat you up anymore." And of course, this is like the late 60s, early 70s. And the kind of thinking that people had around domestic violence and the support that women had was just non-existent, or very different to how it is today. So she kind of went with that. After they were married, of course, he carried on beating her up and being really violent. And then he would say to her, "Well, the reason why I feel like that is because we don't have children. And if we had a family, then I wouldn't feel the need to beat you up." So, of course, when this baby arrived, and in fact, they'd already applied to adopt by then, which I didn't know about until just a few years ago, but they had already applied to adopt and had been told that there was a big waiting list and they weren't going to get they weren't going to get a baby for several years, and they were already, 30 at that time, 30 and 32, I would say. So when this baby literally arrived from the heavens, it was like, oh, well, this is just problem solved now. So that was the home that I went into. And I wasn't planned for. Nobody had anything available. And I just went into, apparently my great-grandmother sat up all night crocheting dresses for me, and they had a drawer for me to sleep in when I got there. So I don't know what social services would say about that now, but I think they would still have a fight on their hands. So, yeah, I grew up knowing that I was adopted, but not knowing anything other than that. And just sometimes thinking about who was this person. And sometimes also thinking about, who was my dad. I remember very young wondering if maybe Elvis Presley was my dad. I don't know why. So it was I think probably because, 1977 is when Elvis Presley died. And I remember that being on the TV. And so maybe it's something kind of stuck in my brain like that when I was very little. So I went on like that, so there was lots of domestic violence. 5.5, 6 years later, after I was born, my adoptive mother actually had fallen pregnant naturally and had my sister. So I have an adopted sister who is the biological child of those adoptive parents. And I absolutely loved the baby. It was just the best thing ever to have a little sister. So we were kind of growing up, and my adoptive father was very pro my sister and not that interested in me. And the other dynamic as well was that, so, if they got into a fight, and I remember sitting at the top of stairs and them getting into fights and things, I would be kind of in between and trying to protect my adoptive mother and so on. Eventually they divorced, and he literally threw me and my adoptive mother out of the house, and he kept my sister. And we went up to my grandma's, and then my auntie arrived, in other words, my mother. And I just remember her saying to my mum behind the back door, do you want me to take Alice back? And they had a big fight, a big physical fight behind the door. And my adoptive mother said, you're not having her back. And that got my little brain thinking about what all that meant. So fast forward, my adoptive mother then moved her boyfriend into the house, and he was a raging alcoholic. So at 11 years old, I remember going downstairs early in the morning and he was already pouring vodka into his coffee. So, he just spent the whole day kind of lost various jobs and so on. So it became really difficult teenage years with all these kind of thoughts in my head around, well, it's just, there was so much toxicity. And the bright spot for me was always my relationship with my grandma and my relationship with my auntie, who was my mother. So they were always my kind of rocks, my stability, and school as well. School was always a thing. Then with the alcoholic stepfather, I was very angry about a lot of things. The abuse from the stepfather, and just angry at being in that situation, I guess. But my adoptive mother used to say things like, you're doing this because you're adopted. And that would make me even madder. So one time we were having a big row about something, and my grandma came up, and my mom said, she's doing this because she wants to know who her mother is. And I hadn't asked at all. And my grandma said, well, you come upstairs with me and I'm going to tell you who your mother is. So I went upstairs and she sat me down and she said, do you love your auntie? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I'm telling you now that your auntie is your mother. But if you love her, you will never talk to her about it. And I remember looking, just being kind of like in the shock of the moment. And I remember asking, and what about my dad? And she said, well, your auntie would never tell us who he was, and you're not to ask her about that either. So I was 14 years old, and that was the secret. So I was now in on the secret and not allowed to ask her anything about it. And by this time, she was married. She had a couple of kids herself, small children. And so now I was the carrier of this family secret as well. And you know what? I didn't ask her a thing about that. And she actually raised the topic with me when I was 22 and pregnant with my oldest. And I never asked her about my dad. I just didn't and she was the one who raised it with me when I was 28. And there was a photo of him in the newspaper because he got married. And that's when she told me. And I just stayed like the good little adoptee. And I moved away when I was 18 and I went to college and I never really moved back home. And I started to kind of get better from all the toxicity that I'd grown up with. I was very depressed as a kind of 16, 17, 18-year-old. And when I look back at it, I had really bad depression. I had issues with anxiety and so on. And just by moving out and taking control of my life, I, started to get myself back on track basically. And that took a long time. But I stayed in touch with my adoptive family and I just tried to manage everything. So there was always tension between my mom and between my mother and my adoptive mother. There was always loads of jealousy. If I walked in the house to my mum's house and then said that evening, I'm going to go down and see my auntie, there would be huge, you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. And then when with my own children, I didn't want them to be in the middle of all that tension. So I never told them about they knew I was adopted, but they didn't know again. So we had the next iteration, the next generation. Anyway, fast forward to when I'm in my late 30s and we had moved away. We were living overseas and my mother became ill with various health problems and then she was diagnosed with a brain tumor. So she was in her just turned 50 at the time she was diagnosed. And then subsequently, in quite quick succession with one another, my adoptive mother died. And then 4 months after that, my mother died as well. So I got 2 meetings with her, two visits when it was just me and her. And we had some short conversations about some of the stuff. Yeah, there were some things that happened after, or just as we were, or just around the time that my adoptive mum died. So that was the kind of story of the 2 mothers. We then moved back to the UK a few years ago, and just by coincidence, by kind of by chance, I was Googling my dad's name, and all of a sudden his kind of social media details came up, and I managed to get in touch with him. So after what was at first a very joyful reunion, I realized I was backing a very, very toxic triangle, and many aspects, but in a shorter time period, many aspects of the toxic things that had happened in terms of jealousies and emotional abuse and kind of gaslighting and all those things, and lying and things that I had grown up with, all those patterns kind of started happening again. And I ultimately decided, after about 18 months of going back into some very dark places, that I was going to end contact with him and that side of the family. So, that was several months ago, and it's taken me some time and some effort to crawl. I was very depressed. I was very down, very, very depressed and down. And just through time and support and, reaching out to other adoptees and all that, I've started getting myself back again, getting back out of that. I had more personal resilience available to me than I did the first time after I left home. And yeah, that's where I'm at now.
Oh my goodness, that is quite the story.
I know.
I don't even know where to go first, but I just find it so amazing that you knew that your mother was your mother from age 14 until she passed away, but you only ever had 2 conversations really with her as your mother. And just the legacy of secrets that adoption gives us, hey? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and that legacy is still reverberating in our family. So, I've only just in the last year, it's coming up for a year because it was on her birthday last year, which was in May, that I decided to talk publicly about her and my relationship with her on social media. But, I have 2 half brothers with her, and there are still times when I'm up in my hometown when I kind of introduce myself to people, and I might comment that I have these 2 brothers and who they are. And of course, some people in the town did know that, but others don't. And so I'm still the one having to tell people. I'm still the one now who's having to kind of break that down. And they've been dead. My 2 mothers have been dead now for several years.
And are you still in a relationship with your brothers then?
Yeah. So I go up and see them quite regularly. I see my adoptive sister less regularly. And so, there are things that I think come from a shared legacy of having been abused and traumatized in our family that makes it harder to have an ongoing relationship. But I love my her children. And I found out when I contacted my biological father that he actually has another daughter who is 25 years younger than me, but as yet, I've not had any contact with her. She knows about me now. She didn't before, but she's never reached out.
All right. Well, that's a lot of pieces. I've got like this map in my head. I'm trying to
Yeah.
I asked you on to specifically talk about are sort of unhealthy relationships, and it sounds like there's a lot of that going on here.
Yeah.
So how did you, I mean, of course, you see physical abuse, you know that is not healthy, that this is a really bad environment to be in. What about the other things? How did you figure out, like, this is not what a healthy family does? Like, did you always know when you were growing up? Like, did you know this is not right, or did you think this is how everybody is living?
Yeah. So if I was to look at some of the friends I had when I was younger, there was definitely abuse going on in those families as well. Not all of them, but certainly some of my closest friends there was. So there wasn't much of a comparison. But I remember when I was at A-level college, which in the UK is when you're about, so I would have been about 17. And a friend from A-level college invited me back to her house to have tea, to have dinner. And I remember sitting down at this table with this family who I'd never met before. I knew the girl, but never met her family before. And we all sat down at this table together and we all had a conversation about the day and what we were doing. And people were passing food around and everything was nice and everything was relaxed. And I suddenly thought, wow, this is what families are actually meant to be like. This is what normal families do. Well, this is an eye opener because, you know, and the dad was sat there. My adoptive father had never been interested in that. And by the time I was 17, oh my goodness, the amount of arguments that used to happen. I mean, literally all the time, my adoptive mother and stepfather were arguing about something. So that was a big eye opener. And then when I went away to university, and again, keep widening your experience and meeting new people, and suddenly realizing, oh my goodness, how kind of exceptionally not right that family environment was. And I think the bright spot and the thing that helped me through was that my grandmother and my aunt, my mother, were really kind and good people. My adoptive mother had some good values and did some good things. So it just wasn't all out and out instability. And then with the teachers around and so on, I managed to kind of get a reasonable head on my shoulders and realize, looking back, oh, right, yeah, there's a lot of really bad stuff going on there.
So you moved out when you were 18 and you said you were depressed, and then you started to slowly come out of that and sort of build a healthy situation for yourself. How did you, or did you, maintain your relationships with your adoptive family and your adoptive sister and your mother? I mean, how did that actually look for you?
So I guess it was mostly telephone calls at the time. We didn't have, so my adoptive mother would have never done emailing or writing. My mother used to write to me frequently. So, she would write, but mostly I would get on the telephone with them and I would have conversations with my adoptive mother. And then, at holiday time and in the summer holidays, in fact, no, most of the summer holidays I worked away as well. Christmas holidays and Easter holidays, at least, which is kind of 3 weeks, I would go back. And so that kind of had a certain momentum to it. But I guess after that, mostly it was by telephone and just having those conversations and telephoning regularly.
And then were there parts of those conversations or visits that you thought, okay, some of your behavior is still kind of impacting me, even though I'm living away? I guess I'm looking for that sort of angle.
This is where I look back on it, and once I found out about different forms of narcissism, this is where I realized what was going on. So most of the time, the conversations I was having with my mum, my adoptive mum, were trying to fix her. So she would be telling me about all the terrible things that all these other people were doing to her. And I was like the shoulder to cry on. I was the one who was trying to fix that. I was the one giving her the guidance. I was the one always trying to say, well, what about this and what about that? And so I looked at that and I thought, well, she's depressed. She won't throw the guy out. She won't do this. So I was always trying to fix her. And then when I look back in my childhood, I was always trying to do that as well. So I was always the one. So if, she would get beaten up for something, and I was the one kind of comforting her and being the parent. So I knew that wasn't, even in my early 20s and 30s, I knew that wasn't the right way round. And I must have lost so many weeks of my life on the telephone to her, trying to convince her. And what I didn't understand is that for some forms of narcissism, that kind of attention of being the permanent victim and being the permanent martyr is a form of supply. So narcissists are always looking for other people's attention to give them, to fill that hole inside of them. And that's what the whole thing was about. And what I realized is that there was never space for my problems and my issues and my difficulties. So if I phoned up and I had a difficulty or a challenge, I would start talking about that. And very quickly, like the stock answer would be, oh, but if you think that's bad, think about all this stuff that's happened to me. And then it would become this diatribe about all these bad things that have happened to her. And then I would get kind of sucked into doing that again. Yeah. And the other thing that was very destructive, which now I look back on it and realize what a kind of narcissistic pattern that was this dynamic of what's called golden child and scapegoat. Now, typically, some narcissists will pick one person to be the golden child and one person to be the scapegoat. But what I realized was that whenever I was on the telephone to my mom, she would be essentially positioning either my sister or her friends or my stepfather as like the scapegoats. So they were the bad people. They were doing all these things to her. And then when I've had conversations with my sister subsequently, what I realized is that then I was the scapegoat on the other side. So she would never say those critical things to your face, but behind your back, she was really, really hypercritical about people.
So how did you come to just even discover, like, of course, we all like sort of know what the term narcissist is. And, in most people's eyes, that would just be like someone that's kind of full of themselves, and it's kind of all about them.
Yeah.
But it seems to me like for a lot of adopted people who are looking for healing in our community, I should stipulate that, they will talk about discovering really what the term narcissism means and then having this new lens to look at the relationships in their life.
Yeah.
So do you remember when you really understood what that meant and looking back and see that your adoptive mother was behaving this way?
Yeah. So that happened because of the reunion with my biological father. I was in touch with him and it started out where he was kind of over the moon. I was the best thing ever. So this is kind of a pattern with narcissists. When you first meet them, they do this thing called love bombing. Now, that would just be normal, right? At the beginning of any kind of reunion, we talk about it as being the honeymoon stage.
I think so. Yeah.
Exactly. So why would that seem any different? But as a consequence of getting in reunion, I ended up just reading every single blinking thing I could get my hands on with regards to reunion. And the more difficult and the more toxic that relationship became, the more I read. And I remember at one point, so just about October or November last year, I think it might have been, what I realized was that in between my biological father, his wife, and me, he was kind of creating a drama triangle between the three of us. So I had been through a process over that year of reunion up till that point, where sometimes I felt like I was the victim. Sometimes I felt like they were treating me like I was the intruder. Sometimes I felt like I was rescuing my dad. And then suddenly when I looked at that, and I journal a lot as well. So journaling has been a huge, huge thing for me since I was 12 years old. So as I was journaling, I was talking about this, I thought, this is familiar. I've read something about these kind of drama triangles, these kind of toxic triangles that happen. And I started looking into that. And then I started discovering things about what's called covert narcissism, which is a different form of narcissism to the big grandiose, I'm all this, I'm all that, the kind of the popular version that we might be aware of. The covert narcissism is where people are essentially, like the ultimate martyr, the ultimate victim, and they get their supply in that way. So it's a kind of a narcissist with really poor self-esteem, if that's so. And you would never think that could exist. So then from there, I ended up, again, just doing searches, finding some material from a guy called Ross Rosenberg, who talks about narcissism and codependency going together. Now, I knew from, my growing up with an alcoholic in the family that codependency was a thing, but I always thought that my adoptive mum was the codependent. But then when I read about covert narcissism, I was like, oh my goodness, but that also describes her to a T as well. And then I ended up, from finding out more and more of my story from my biological father, who had his own stories to tell, I suddenly realized that the dynamic in my original family had been that my grandmother and my mother were really codependent to this narcissistic person in their midst. And literally everything that my grandmother did was to please and look after and make right the life of her eldest daughter, including making her youngest daughter give her child. And once I got that lens, everything just came into focus, just like everything. And then I realized, I think actually this dynamic is existing in my biological father's family, not just him, not just his wife, but also extended members in the family. And you just see that pattern everywhere then. And I suddenly realized, I think adoption can also happen in families with issues with narcissism and codependency. And it was just fascinating to kind of step back from that and say, oh, wow, look at how all these pieces fit together.
So you didn't ever see her really as this covert, is that what it is? Covert narcissist?
No, I didn't. Yes.
Until she had already passed away.
Yes.
So you just had this relationship with her, for her lifetime, and that was just dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And then looking back, you can see these patterns. But you said that you were in a reunion with your bio father for 18 months, and then you decided to cut off contact. So can you tell us how you came to that decision? Because we often talk about just, putting up our healthy boundaries, and what made you decide to cut off contact versus trying to set up some boundaries, or, walk us through that kind of decision, if you would.
Yeah. So it was just repeated examples of gaslighting and manipulative behavior that was happening. And at first, for quite a while, he was very good at blaming other people for that. So he spent quite a lot of time initially, after, at the same time as love bombing me, also explaining all the difficulties his wife had with me and all the issues she had with me. And he was kind of, and I kind of bought into that initially, and I was quite upset about it. And there were times when he did things that felt like I was being treated like the other woman rather than a daughter. And, I knew that was happening. And so I would have conversations with him. so that I met his wife for the first time. So we got in touch with one another in like the June, and then I met his wife for the first time in person in the November, so a few months later. And she took me aside for a couple of hours or an hour or so and told me a whole load of stuff which directly contradicted a bunch of stuff that he had told me, including telling me that my father had told her that my mother was essentially sleeping around all the time, and that when they'd met, he'd said, well, maybe Alice isn't even my kid anyway. So I was 7 by the time they met one another, and he knew of me. And he admitted he'd known of me for those 7 years, and he'd tried to take presents and was never allowed by my adopted mum. So when I pulled him up on this, I organized a meeting to meet with him face to face, and I pulled him up on it. And he gaslighted me from start to finish about that whole process. So it was like, well, I told you that. And I said, no, you didn't. No, that wasn't the intention of what you said. And then he said, well, then you've misunderstood what I said initially. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm not misunderstanding it. And then he kind of got mad. And then he said, well, what do you want? And then he got really sad. And they were all this kind of ream of manipulative tactics. So that happened. And then things would get lovely again. And then some other drama would get created. And that just became an ongoing pattern. And all the time that was happening, I was feeling worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point where I went through times when I felt like maybe I shouldn't exist anymore. Maybe it was never the universe's intention for me to be here anyway, that I didn't deserve to live. I was in such, and I've not been in such a black place as that since I was living with those toxic people, since I was like 18 years old. And it came to a head we went to a birthday meal with him and his wife. So me and my husband went to this birthday meal, and we sat there as a foursome around the table. And as soon as the food came, he and his wife were like all over one another as though they were a courting couple just together. And these are, grown people. But they were just like, feeding one another off their fork. They were only talking to one another. They were whispering in one another's ears. They were like hugging and kissing, like they were at a romantic dinner for two, with me and my husband sat there looking at them. And that was really weird. And I started getting very, very, very triggered by it. I went to the bathroom because it just felt so awful, this situation. It was like they were behaving like I didn't exist, and that was plugging into other stuff. And I came back. I'd got a number for a taxi, and I sat down, and the wife said to me, "Is everything okay?" And I looked at her and I said, "No, not really. No, I just feel like I want to go home." And she said, "Well, okay, I'll take you if you like." That was the first response. So I said, "I don't want you to take me." We ended up calling a taxi and I went home. I then had a conversation with him a week later, and again, he was gaslighting me. He was saying, "You were too sensitive. Why didn't you just say something to us? That's how we always act when we're with people. That was nothing unusual. Why would you be like that? Why, you've got so many problems as an adoptee. You need to get over your adoption problems." It was like, all of this is your problem. Anyway, gosh, so why would I recount this story and I think to myself, why would I even continue at this point? But I said, okay, in the future, I would tell you if I kind of got sucked into making it better again. And then I said, okay, so if you've got any issues, so I kind of had some real boundaries there, and I'd written it down. I said, first of all, I don't want you to badmouth my mother anymore, because regularly he would have bad things to say about her. She's dead, so please, she doesn't have a right, she can't reply for herself. Just leave her alone, leave her in peace. I don't need to hear anything from you about that. I don't anyway. If you and your wife have some kind of issues about her or me, please don't drag me into it anymore. I don't want to hear about your wife's problems with me anymore. please can you go and see somebody or see, but please, I can't be the one kind of listening to how she doesn't like me and all this. Oh, she doesn't have any problems with you. She's never had any problems with you. It was complete gaslighting. And then I said, I just want things to be normal. I just want us to be able to go out. I want us to be able to have dinner and for things to be normal. Okay, so those are the boundaries. So we organized that he would come over on the Saturday before Christmas, and it would just be him, and he would come and have lunch at our house. And the children would be there. I would give them the presents for him and his wife and my sister. And I wouldn't be seeing him over Christmas because I wasn't allowed, because that was for so-called real family. So I knew that. And so that was what we set up. And then just a couple of days before that was due to happen, he messaged me and he said, can we meet alone on Saturday instead of me coming to your house? And I said, why? And he said, because it would make my life so much easier. And it was like a red flag. I just saw him dragging me back into this drama triangle again. Please rescue me. I'm the victim. I'm being persecuted by my wife. And I just got to being done. I was just done with it. I just saw it all. It was like, this is so obvious now. You've literally 3 weeks before spent an hour telling me on the phone how this is all in my head. And you've just come and done that now right before Christmas. And that is such a classical sign with narcissism. And I just thought, that is the end. That is the end. I don't want to be in that anymore. I don't know if a psychiatrist would ever certify any of these people, but what I do know is that I don't want that kind of behavior in my life. I just don't want it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, when we're deciding these things, are you going no contact or boundaries? I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of boundaries you set up if they keep disrespecting it and they're not going to play fair. I mean, that is just, how can you keep that up? Right?
What I think as well, so if I was to look at that, I don't feel angry to him or to my adoptive mother for being like that, in that I think they also experienced that in their families beforehand. I think they had their own traumas. I think they didn't realize that that's what it was. I think they don't know what normal, happy, healthy families are, what those dynamics are. And so it's just the water that they swim in. But I realized that I don't have to be the one to keep rescuing them out of that. There isn't. I spent so long with my adoptive mother, hours trying to convince her otherwise. But what it does is it just feeds the need to have that. You just become another form of supply. So I'm not angry. I don't think they're evil people. I think they have a lot of issues. And if they're going to get through those issues, so I had a grief counselor after my adoptive mother died, and I remember saying to her, why could we not fix her? Why could she not do this for her children? She said, well, people with that level of difficulty, they need to spend years in therapy and you're not placed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
You're not. So what I knew is that I just had to look after myself. And that's really where the ultimate boundary came in.
I remember my psychologist telling me this a couple times because I didn't understand the first time, that, when you are going to therapy and you're working on yourself and you are getting more healthy and, you're in the people in your life that have lots of problems going on and they're not getting help, you're just moving farther and farther away. And that gap just widens and widens, and you don't want them to drag you back down.
No, it's exactly that. Exactly that. And also, we work hard for where we get to and what we have, after overcoming all of this stuff. And One thing that really occurred to me was that, so what I didn't want to do with my dad was repeat the cycle of abandonment. What I didn't want to do is abandon him. I really didn't want to do that. But it got to the point where I realized that the cycle of abandonment had to end with me, which meant I had to not abandon myself to it. So ending the cycle of abandonment meant not abandoning myself. And that was the ultimate point.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was so profound, Alice. Let's move and do our recommended resources. I'm going to go first. I love Instagram. I don't know if you're on there, but I love Instagram. And one of my follows is someone I've had on the show before, Melissa Nicholson. So she's a therapist and she did our healing episode on suicide. And Melissa posted a repost from Steffi Wagner, and it was just a little quote, but I read it and I was like, oh my goodness, this is so true. So I went right over to Steffi's account right away. The quote was, "My life changed the day I realized I would never be enough for my mother."
My God, yes.
So
exactly that.
So I saved that because I was like, I need to recommend this when I talked to Alice because I knew our topic. And so I went over, and what I'm recommending is that you follow Steffi Wagner on Instagram. She's got lots of quotes about this. She works with the mother wound. Now, I don't think she's adopted, but she does know what it's like to reparent yourself and have a toxic mother in your life. I've been thinking about that quote for days, actually. And
but that also speaks to the narcissistic wound,
right.
This kind of unhealable thing that these people feel, which if they feel as though that attention from other people can only is the only thing that will fill them up. But as you said, the experience that I had growing up was exactly that. There was nothing I could do, no marks I could get, no way of being, no amount of time on the telephone, nothing I could do that would ever be enough. Yeah, it's exactly that.
Well, and I mean, for a lot of adopted people, myself included, like I'm not saying my mother is a narcissist, but for a lot of us, we were adopted because our parents were infertile, and this was like the solution. And so we get put on this pedestal like this is the answer to all of our hopes and dreams, is this baby. And no one can stand up to that. You just can't. No one can live up to that sort of pressure. So that's sort of what that quote brought up for me.
Yeah.
Okay. I would love to hear your resource because I've heard you talk about it before and it's so good. So I want you to tell everyone what it is.
My favorite resource in this area is the YouTube channel of Ross Rosenberg. He is an American psychotherapist. And in particular, I mean, he has lots and lots of videos on his YouTube channel, but in particular, he talks about this relationship between narcissism and codependency and how they make a kind of, I don't know if symbiotic is the right way to describe it, to be honest, but some kind of almost infernal dance with one another. And that absolutely lit my brain up because I realized, I think in one of his videos, he describes the codependent partner in this kind of narcissistic relationship as being like the salt of the earth, the kind of loveliest people ever. These real kind of kind people are often, the kind of codependents that kind of get sucked into this relationship with a narcissist. And that was so much my grandmother and my mother. I mean, both of them had such kind personalities, and they literally gave my adoptive mother everything that was most precious in order to try and fill that need that would never be enough. So, they gave her a child, they gave her money, they gave her a place to live, they kept picking her up, they did this, they did that. And it was never going to be enough. And it surprised the heck out of me. I even look back at it and I realized that my alcoholic stepfather was always the giver. He was the codependent. He was alcoholic, but nevertheless, in that relationship, he was always the one. He went to work, he gave her the money, he did this, he did that. And she worked hard to look after the home and to keep the image. And I still feel guilty somehow to talk about it like that, because she wasn't at the top end of the entire monster scale. So she did some good things in life as well. So as I said earlier, I wouldn't necessarily have said that she should be in a kind of psychiatric ward somewhere, but nevertheless, there was a heck of a lot of this kind of narcissistic behavior. But I think narcissists can do, so if I look at my biological father and his wife, I'm still not quite convinced who's the narcissist and who's the codependent. And I think that behavior and that relationship can just become like that. It was so fascinating to hear Ross Rosenberg speak about all these different complex aspects of why people end up in relationships with narcissists, how being so nice and so selfless. Now, how often do we hear that in the adoption narrative as well for, first mothers? Oh, they're just these selfless beings. They're just so wonderful, wanting to give their babies away to these needy people who need those babies in order to make their lives so right. That is such a narcissistic theme when you look at it. So yeah, I would encourage everybody within the adoption area to look at that YouTube channel.
It's so worth just doing some investigating into these terms that we've said. We've thrown around a bunch of terms. So narcissism, codependency. You talked very briefly about the toxic triangle.
Yeah.
So just looking into some of these things, and we're not saying that everyone in your life is a narcissist or codependent, but when you can spot some of these behaviors, it can help you set up your boundaries and what you're going to accept and not. Or you can take these things to your therapist, your meeting with your therapist, and say, what are some strategies I can use? This person is behaving in this way. So it gives you some extra language to use.
I think so, yeah.
Well, it was so great talking with you today, Alice. And if people would like to connect with you, they can go to adopteeson.com and send a note through the website, and then I will forward it on to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Thanks, Haley. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. My pleasure. If you want to carry on the discussion, if you want to connect with other adoptees that have had similar experiences, maybe you have a narcissistic mother or someone else in your circles that you're having a hard time dealing with, come and connect with us online. So like I said, on adopteeson.com/connect, you can send Alice a message, or you can sign up there to support the show on Patreon, which is a website that it's basically like crowdfunding. So you can pledge a monthly gift, and there's a secret Facebook group for adoptees only. And we talk about some of the things just like this issue in the group. Or you can come and comment on Instagram. We have a Twitter account, and we also have a Facebook page. So any of those places are great resources for you to connect with other adoptees. If you're looking for an in-person support group, I can hopefully steer you in the right direction as well. Just send me a message, and I will do what I can to connect you with other adoptees. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Let's talk again next Friday.